This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
What was going on in Luther's mind when he nailed up the 95 Theses on the cathedral door? Did he know at that point that he was doing something really big, or did he think that he was just sparking a debate?
That's one of the big discussions about that event. It will probably never be fully resolved. It should be said that putting theses up on the castle church door was how you organized a debate, and he was just asking to organize a debate. It's not like he was, shoving this up the Pope's nose or something. But it's also questionable whether Luther did it himself. Some people have suggested he had an assistant go do it. That stuff all doesn't really matter. He certainly knew that, some of his points were contentious, but he figured that it would be, talked about, discussed quietly amongst the professionals in Wittenberg, I think. That said, and you see this a little bit in the 2003 movie, there's a character that was named, I believe, Lucas Cranach, who was the court painter of Frederick the Wise, who is also one of the early success stories of printing. And you see him twice in the 2003 movie, and the first time he goes and reads the 95 Theses, and he yanks them down and goes to his assistant, "We got to get this printed," or something along those lines, and then they're running off copies and everything. I think one thing to say is that the printing of Luther's material was extremely important, but I also think that it was a little bit more organized, and that's where you can sort of go back and forth about whether he planned this to be a big thing. I don't know if he and Cranach got together and said, definitely let's get this printed and get it widely publicized. Off the top of my head, I don't remember that, but I know that shortly thereafter, Luther and Cranach were together in business, running off copies of his speeches and his pamphlets and his broadsheets and distributing them extremely widely, not just in Wittenberg, but around the Holy Roman Empire and Germany and Europe in general. And that doesn't seem like the action of someone who wants to keep things under wraps. But I think to a certain extent he did want to get his message out there, and eventually events took a course that he probably felt like he had to keep going. Cranach made so much money off of this. And it's the state of the printing industry at the time is something worth talking about, that there was a lot of competition. There were a lot of printers out there, and in times like that, when there's a lot of competition in a media environment, of course you want to publicize things and get you want eye-catching headlines. You want, for lack of a better term, possibly somewhat anachronistic, but you want to generate controversy, you want to generate stuff that people will read, and there's nothing more controversial than having a guy attack the very basis of Western Christianity. And so Luther's material sold like hotcakes, and Cranach put in a lot of work to build up Luther, the character, the figurehead of a movement, and then, Cranach was a skilled printmaker in terms of the graphics, and so all these things that were printed by Cranach promoting Luther and Lutheran ideas were very attractively presented. They had exciting pictures for people who couldn't read, and they were very accessible. And Luther's rhetorical style definitely contributed to that.
Did a Augustinian monk, doctor in a university, was there a culture there where you could put up a couple of pretty controversial items and it wasn't immediately you'd get sent to the Inquisition? Was there a culture of debate?
Oh, yeah. The Catholic Church was actually very open. And this is a big misconception, I think. And it's based a lot on the propaganda conflicts that happened after Luther, because the Protestants wanted to portray the Catholics as these barbarous monsters who were burning people left and right, and certainly there was the burning of heretics, but the Catholic Church always conceived of itself as a big tent, and there was a lot of leeway for debate and difference. There were some lines that couldn't be crossed, but also there were a lot of steps before, they got to burning people, where, you were totally allowed to have these debates. And one of the things that could end these debates was someone pointing out that you sounded like a heretic, and then you'd go, oh, I didn't mean it that way. Maybe I should reconsider what I'm talking about. And then they'd think about it, and they'd come back with a different angle or something like that. Or maybe they'd hold on to their position, but the hierarchy just wouldn't consider it that big a deal to burn someone over it. There was a lot of difference of opinion allowed, especially within these universities. And part of that was just that the Catholic Church was not some monolithic entity with secret police everywhere. And part of it was just the culture that had developed in these universities that valued, open debate and thought as part of the pedagogical process, right? They were built on classical precedents, and one of the big classical precedents is the Socratic dialogues. And so debates and dialogue were part of the process. The thing with Luther, I guess, is that he got to a point where someone said, you sounded a little bit like a heretic. And he said, yeah, so's your mom. And, and then things went downhill. But of course, that also sold really well in the popular press.
One of the things that we can maybe get into a little bit now, and then we'll definitely be getting into it as we progress. Luther didn't live in a vacuum, and he had a circle of scholars around him. Who were some of these people who were players? They got into, each of the movies got into his supporting cast to differing degrees, but there was a couple of heavy hitters who worked with him and under him. What can we say about them? One of them in particular was Philip Melanchthon, which when they said his name, I didn't even know how I would go about spelling it. And I had never heard of him in my life.
Melanchthon ends up being the heavy hitter. He really... A lot of the stuff that gets attributed to the Protestant Reformation was down to Melanchthon. And Luther definitely viewed Melanchthon as sort of his intellectual right-hand man to a large extent. Melanchthon was another professor at Wittenberg. I don't know off the top of my head a ton of his background, but he was very influenced by the Renaissance. He was very much a humanist. And one of the things that was big for Luther is that Luther was kind of a humanist too. To set the intellectual background here, again, they weren't in a vacuum, an intellectual vacuum even. Humanism, as part of from the Italian Renaissance, had been spreading throughout Europe. And this was a period that has been called by historians the German Renaissance. And you see this flowering of art and literature, and the fact that it coincided with the rise of printing meant that a lot of art and literature was popularized along these lines. And all this thought was spreading around that sort of hadn't been available before. And so Melanchthon was the intellectual heavy hitter of the Protestant group. He would go on to spearhead the educational reforms, which really became a huge cornerstone of the long-term success of Protestantism. He reorganized the schools to be less doctrinaire and focus on, again, more of this debate style, this back-and-forth pedagogical style that went beyond just talking about the Bible to talking about some of the philosophers and philosophy in general. And ended up, and a big part of that was then using these schools, which were very, top of the line, to train Lutheran pastors who would then go out and spread the word. And that had so much to do with the long-term success of Lutheranism and Protestantism in general. And, a lot of what we associate with the Protestant Reformation now is stuff like, not being beholden to the Catholic theology anymore, focusing on humanistic stuff. And of course, none of that was really stuff that Luther was specifically talking about. It all comes from Melanchthon and his educational reforms, which is interesting and sort of something that doesn't get brought out a ton, and it's certainly not in the movies. But Melanchthon was a real important guy for that in that regard, and he even had a hand in I think it was Tycho Brahe. He helped get some of his works published because Brahe was kind of he was big in the rise of the scientific revolution, but he was kind of a hermit. I may be saying the wrong guy, but Melanchthon helped get his works published, and so there's a lot that comes back to Melanchthon and not necessarily to Luther. Luther was certainly an intellectual child of the humanist of the Renaissance of that environment, but he was much. His background was much more in the monastery, and he was much more focused on Augustine than on these other characters than on the classical philosophers and stuff like that. He knew about them. He like I've said, he was a smart guy. He was an intellectual heavy hitter, but he was much more focused on the theology, and he really leaned on Melanchthon to help make Lutheranism defensible to the intellectual elite, if that makes any sense.
One of the other heavy hitters in Luther's party was a man named Andreas Karlstadt, and the movie portrays it. Each of the movies show it in a slightly different way, but basically when the heat gets turned up on Luther and he has to hide out, they sort of portray it as Karlstadt runs wild, and we get into this play with the peasants' revolts, and Karlstadt took things in a very different direction with smashing of religious art, things that Luther wasn't necessarily down with, and then Luther comes back all mad. Right. What's some of the story with that section of it's a little bit later in the narrative than we're at, but it's still sort of interesting to have that under our belts before we move on.
Karlstadt's interesting because he was Luther's senior and had been just sort of plugging away as a by the numbers theologian at the faculty at Wittenberg, and then Luther comes in, and Karlstadt was an early supporter, and Karlstadt definitely went in a fairly radical direction once he had the ability. He was an intellectual heavy hitter himself. He always gets sort of the short end of the stick from history. He did sort of rile things up in Wittenberg while Luther was away. But the thing is that this doesn't happen in the 2003 movie. This doesn't happen in the 1953 movie, but it does happen in the 2003 movie. Karlstadt was not responsible for the peasant revolt, at least not directly. But while Luther was off screen, Karlstadt was, raising the pressure to try and, make it, for whatever reason, he thought that was the right thing to do. Now is the time, blah, blah, blah. To a certain extent, people got carried away, and there was a series of events called the Iconoclast Riots, which was much more focused on the stuff that you see in the 1953 movie, where people were running into churches and smashing images and looting the churches and stuff. You can sort of see where it comes from a theological basis. The Bible, the Old Testament, I guess, says, no graven images, and, the church is supposed to be, It's easy to say that the church should be more focused on poverty and helping people rather than enriching itself. And so you can sort of see the line from the Catholic Church as the whore of Babylon to let's go loot that church. They shouldn't have all that stuff. And that is eventually the way that some Protestant denominations would go, but Luther was definitely not about that. I mean, Luther was joined at the hip to Cranach, who was an artist and a printer, and this stuff was helping push Luther's word out there, and within the context of the medieval church, and it should be said, get back to this. Luther was not really, at least he didn't see himself as that radical. He was very much basing his theology on the settled theology of Western Catholic Christianity. So he didn't want to go back and fight the iconoclastic fights of the Byzantine Empire. He didn't want to refight all the Trinitarian debates. This stuff wasn't coming up for him. It was just the Pope shouldn't, be taking all your money with the, faith, not works, and, all that. And you should be able to read the Bible yourself. But, pictures in churches, not everyone is literate. So having pictures in churches helps poor illiterate peasants be able to understand what's going on, and that's important. It makes people feel uplifted when they're in a nice sanctuary with lots of pretty things going on. And Luther himself was extremely into art and very much into music more than anything. The hymns that he wrote are still used in Lutheran churches. So the idea of people rampaging and destroying art was pretty upsetting to him. That said, the scenes that we get in both movies, and this is where one of the points where I say that the 2003 movie is just a remake of the 1953 movie. You get the scene in the 1953 movie where Luther comes back disguised as a knight, and everyone doesn't recognize him at first, and then he goes up to Karlstadt, and everyone recognizes him, and he's like, "Yay!" And Karlstadt says, "I kept the fires burning in your absence," essentially. And Luther's like, "Yeah, you did. Get out of here. Everything's on fire. Get out of here." So, there's a version of that scene, much more publicly and humiliatingly for Karlstadt in the 2003 version, none of which happened. The Luther came back and restored order, but he didn't run Karlstadt out of town. Karlstadt ended up leaving Wittenberg, but he and Luther maintained a fairly cordial correspondence for many years. That said, Karlstadt did end up being an early, there's sort of a split within the Reformation movement, if you will, and Karlstadt was one of the early other poles of that, and Luther would end up spending a lot of his life trying to convince Karlstadt to come back into the fold, and somewhat unsuccessfully, but Karlstadt really ended up having his thunder stolen by the Anabaptists and Zwingli, and then ultimately John Calvin sort of took all those various ideas and really ran with them, to the point that most modern Protestant denominations are actually Calvinist, not Lutheran, and certainly not Karlstadtian.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. It's interesting you bring up Calvin now. Calvin and Zwingli, where do they fit into this situation? Because it's almost seems like it's a parallel movement going on. Did they get their impetus from Luther, or were they going on their own path outside of Luther?
So, I've mentioned the importance of printing, and this is where it really becomes important. The ideas of Luther spread throughout the German-speaking world really fast. Because of the printing press, there were no controls in place for dealing with literature like this. There was this very long legal process that had to be gone through for declaring a work heretical and getting it burned by the authorities and stuff like that. And there was no responsible mechanism within the printing community to anyone other than their bottom line. And so they would just print stuff and send it, and If something was really popular in City A, and a merchant from City B found it and brought it back, the printers in City B would take it and go, this is selling really well in City A, let's print 1,000 copies of it and sell it on the streets. So there also weren't any copyright controls that would control that kind of thing, which made it spread ridiculously fast. And within a few years, this stuff made it to the Swiss Confederation, and up into the Low Countries. In the Swiss Confederation, that's where we got Zwingli, who was an early, very radical Protestant. And then in the Low Countries, the material got translated into French. It got translated into French a couple different times, a couple different ways. But we're pretty sure that it was one of the copies of Luther's works from the Low Countries that made its way down to John Calvin in the south of France. An area which had been a hotbed of heretical activity that had been crushed by the Inquisition, and the Inquisition was still burning people at this point. The Southern French, to this day, to modern days, still kind of resent the Northern French for a lot of this. They have something of their own identity. And so John Calvin was down there in Southern France and got a hold of the Lutheran materials and started conceiving his own ideas. He'd been a little bit of a radical anyway, and then he managed to get himself some protection from a local noble, but the nobles in France weren't able to provide anywhere near as much protection as they were in Germany. So after a number of years of writing and building popular support in southern France, where he was, he ended up being the basis of the Huguenots in southern France. He eventually had to flee, and he fled to Switzerland, where Zwingli had died at that point. And Calvin was very, very young when Luther was still alive, and so we're pretty far in the future now. But Calvin ended up setting up shop in Geneva, and Geneva became a massive hotbed of really radical Protestantism. It was as close to a Christian theocracy as the Western world has ever seen. It was, dancing is forbidden kinds of things. And Zwingli had died in battle with one of the Catholic cantons in Switzerland. Calvin, also built up the military force of the Protestant cantons in Switzerland, and then from Switzerland, you're talking about a country that has German-speaking, French-speaking, and Italian-speaking populations, and lots of wealthy cities with printing presses. From Switzerland, Calvin's works just went everywhere. To the point that one of the big issues that led to the 30 Years' War was that, and this is getting way, way down the line, there had been sort of a settlement between the Catholics and the Lutherans, but then these Calvinists just started showing up everywhere. And Calvin would have a huge influence in England. It was really the works of Calvin that made their way to the Low Countries and then to England that influenced the course of Protestantism in England. The Puritans were basically Calvinists. The Presbyterians are Calvinists. A Calvinist preacher made his way to Scotland, and that's where the Presbyterians come from. So Calvin's works went really far and wide. Luther's works, and maybe I should stop here because you just asked about Calvin, but I can get to Luther's spread later.
Yeah, this is probably a good time. We'll back up a little bit to Luther's set of debates. He's basically called out by the Catholic organization to answer for these things that he's been writing and saying, and they all kind of come down at the synod at Augsburg. What led up to that I guess you might say that blowout between Luther and the mainline Catholic hierarchy? So this is really interesting that both movies sort of breeze over the interim, and the 2003 one does a really big job of this. There's a couple of elements here. First of all, it wasn't just like all of a sudden the Catholic Church said,
out of nowhere, Luther, you're a heretic, go to Augsburg. There was a ramp up. There were a couple interactions leading up to that. But ultimately, Luther was being protected by Frederick the Wise, who was the Elector of Saxony, which is a little bit more complex than it sounds, but let's not get into the politics of Upper versus Lower Saxony. Frederick the Wise very much had an interest in the soft power game of Renaissance-era politics. He had built up this university at Wittenberg. It was his university. He founded it. The movie shows that he had a pretty massive collection of relics, and he was very interested in having Wittenberg become one of the intellectual focuses of Germany. He probably also was pious in his own way. He did essentially get rid of his relics after Luther really got going. He probably was more or less convinced by Luther's arguments. Anyway, because Frederick the Wise was offering Luther protection, the way that you had to go for prosecuting Luther wasn't that anyone could just show up at his door and arrest him. And this is shown in the movie pretty well. The papacy couldn't just get Luther. And this gets back to that. The empire wasn't just divided between the papacy and the emperor. This local noble could intercede on behalf of this guy and offer him protection. All law and order had to flow from the local landowner, which was Frederick the Wise. But the emperor could declare someone an enemy of the empire, and so that led to this diet at Augsburg, where it was basically a trial of Luther's ideas. There had been a couple debates before that, where Luther debated official representatives of the church. That didn't go so well, but in this case, essentially, they show in the movie that he didn't feel in this case that he could go personally, because it wasn't clear that he would be safe. But they sort of show in the movie that Luther was at home twiddling his thumbs. But actually, while the Protestants were debating with the Catholics, simultaneously, the different branches of the Protestants were debating amongst themselves. And this is where the split with Karlstadt is important, because at this point, Karlstadt was still the main guy. Zwingli was out there in Switzerland, but Calvin hadn't shown up yet. And Luther was furiously writing to all these people, trying to get some kind of consensus about what they all believed. Meanwhile, the Protestants, are at this diet with the Catholics, and a lot of the princes and the free cities and everything that you see in the movie essentially say that they are going to take Luther's side. And the Catholic powers that be, the Pope and the Emperor, say, all right, well, what is it that Luther believes? Because at this point, one of the things, and there was a debate scene earlier in the movie where Luther was asked to say yes or no whether he supported these works, and there's just a table full of books. In the real historical event, Luther saying, I don't know, was more than just, a delaying tactic. Because of what I said earlier about how printers weren't following copyrights, they also weren't following quality control. And a lot of the things that people thought about what Luther said were actually inaccurate based on these reprints. A lot of crazy things were attributed to Luther that just weren't true. And so when they said, do you take responsibility for all these books? He's kind of like, I don't know where these came from. I need to go through them. So when they got to the diet at Augsburg, it was like, all right, we don't want to go through that again. What is it that you do believe? And then we can debate whether or not, that's okay. And so the interesting thing is that Augsburg it's called the Confession of Augsburg, or the Agreement of Augsburg, which is important because slightly later on, there was a peace treaty at Augsburg, and these things get confusing. But so the Protestants essentially got together, led by Melanchthon. They put together. They get together and sort of try and hash out what it is that they actually do believe in together. And this process took months. It may have taken more than a year. And they eventually put together a confession of beliefs. And it was a massive compromise between these different parties. And it was sort of drafted quickly. And when Luther got his hands on it, he kind of hit the roof. There's a lot of stuff in there that he wasn't happy about. And they delivered it to the emperor, and the emperor said, well, I need some time to think about this. And basically everyone went home, and nothing happened. Which is why there's no climactic scene where the emperor says, all right, guys, you got me. This is fine. Because the emperor never really said that. The emperor was just kind of like, if you deliver me a statement of your beliefs, I will consider what to do. And then they delivered the statement of beliefs, and he said, I will think about this. But there's some important political context here, because this was... Sorry. Okay, so this was Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. Emperor, of the HRE. This was Charles V of the HRE, and he had at this point been at war for 30 years. Continuously, with various different people. The Ottomans had been attacking him. He'd been fighting the French in Italy and along the Rhine. There were various internal revolts because the Holy Roman Empire was just very unstable. And Denmark had been fighting him as well, because Denmark was technically an elector in the Holy Roman Empire, because they owned Schleswig-Holstein at the time. And so he just spent his entire reign playing whack-a-mole. And if you think that the Pope was broke and exhausted by his wars, Charles was fighting in the same wars plus like 5 others. And so by the time of Augsburg, he really needed things to stop. And so basically he just sort of let it be for a little while. And it sort of rested there, where he just wasn't going to attack anyone, and they, and things were just going to sort of be that way for a while, because he was fighting the French in Italy. And one thing that should be said about this is that the Protestant princes were getting aid from the French and the Danes at this time. So what ended up happening, so the movie ends with, them delivering their confession of faith, and the emperor going, just being really upset about it. But there's nothing he can do, because everybody stepped forward and they said that we believe this too. Realistically, he still held more of the empire than they did. Most of the empire was still Catholic. But he had the Ottomans knocking on his door. He had the French attacking him in Italy, which was technically still part of the Holy Roman Empire. He's fighting with the Pope. He's fighting with the Danes. So ultimately, he just let it be. During that time where he was just kind of, I'm going to let it be, Luther died. Shortly thereafter, Charles V really wiped the floor with the French army to a really extreme degree. And the Danes ended up getting into their own trouble up north, and the Ottomans were also exhausted. So, all of a sudden, everything that had been keeping this sort of precarious balance in place in the empire goes away. And Charles V turns around, and he has an army which has had 30 years of active combat experience. And he goes up against several princes, a couple free cities, and some free knights who have sort of been enjoying a lot of peace for a very long time. And even if they hadn't been, they are less than half of the empire between them. And that's the War of the Schmalkaldic League, where the Schmalkaldic League was this league of the Protestant princes and the free cities and everybody. It was a military alliance, defensive in nature, of the Lutheran princes. And Charles V came at them with his army with 30 years of combat experience and just wiped the floor up with them in an extremely comically easy fashion, really. It was not really even a contest. And just completely destroyed them. But then, while he's in the process of, like, occupying these territories, there was, another small battle which the princes won, and it sort of became clear that these people were violently committed to their religion. And if he was going to take care of this problem, he was going to need to keep his army in the field, occupying their territories and, like, militarily imposing Catholicism back on these territories. And it had been 30 years of fighting, and he was out of money, and he was exhausted. And meanwhile, the French are sitting there going, "We'll get with you in 1 second. We need 1 minute to get our army back together, and we'll be back." The Danes are licking their wounds, and the Ottomans are just over the Balkan mountains. And basically, Charles V said, "All right, we'll have a peace treaty." And so the peace treaty of Augsburg is probably much more important in the long term than the Confession of Augsburg. The Confession of Augsburg, well, let me come back to that point. But the peace treaty of Augsburg is that the Protestants won't evangelize anymore. The official religion of any territory is the religion of its prince, but Charles isn't going to come after princes who are Protestants. And there's a bunch of details. It recognizes the right of the Lutherans to exist and offers up the hope that everyone will come back into communion at some point soon. That said, and so this held out peace for a little while, but eventually it broke down and then the 30 Years' War happened. But getting back to the Confession of Augsburg, that isn't very important politically or militarily. And it wasn't the open-shut case that it's portrayed as in the movie. But for the Lutherans, that is the closest they have to a real, actual document of what they actually believe. It was the closest thing to a consensus position that was ever produced in that early form of the Protestant Reformation. And so, for Lutherans today, despite a lot of, going back and forth and hemming and hawing at the time, the Confession of Augsburg is still basically their official theological document of what they believe. So it has importance at that level, and so you can sort of see why a couple movies that were sponsored by the Lutheran Church would end up with this emotional high point at the Confession of Augsburg.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. A little bit later in Luther's life, he changes a lot where he abandons his priestly celibacy. The movie in 2003 spends a little bit more time on that. What kind of life did he live after all of these events?
Well, so we're a little bit out of time, both in terms of where this was in the movie and when things happened in his life. He didn't live too long after the Confession of Augsburg, which is why it's often a good, beyond the intellectual importance of the confession, that's why it's always a good spot to cut a movie. But in terms of the changes to his life, it should be said that he was a vowed bachelor even after leaving the monastery, but he eventually he was helping nuns who had escaped from convents find marriages in a fairly rapid fashion, which is a little bit of a, it seems really like, all right, this one needs a husband. We got any husbands? Anybody? Hands up. But the concept of romantic love hadn't really been fleshed out at the time. A lot of people had arranged marriages. Of course, Catherine von Bora was one of the nuns who escaped from a convent and essentially wouldn't have anyone except Luther. At least that's the way it's told. Luther's opponents said that no one else would have her, and so he resigned himself to marrying the shrew, and spent the rest of his life getting harped at. But within Protestant circles, all reports are that they had a fairly happy marriage, and they had several children, and Catherine von Bora was actually a fairly important part of his life, helped frame some of his theology, and was very, very active participant in the creation and running of his movement, at the very least in terms of keeping him from dying young, from not taking care of himself, which he was prone to do. So that's an interesting thing. It can't have been easy to live with him, but yeah. So that was a big part of it.
So we've gotten into all these different aspects, but there's one other, if we're really focusing in on Luther and some of his, the aftermaths, let's talk a little bit more about the Peasants' War.
Right. So this was in the 2003 movie. This was wrapped into the iconoclast riots, like I mentioned. And in the 1953 movie, it was entirely ignored. But it was one of the first sort of signs of what's to come with all this. The peasants got their hands on a lot of Lutheran and Lutheran-inspired literature, and including a lot of the works of Karlstadt, it should be said. But and they basically conceived of, and a lot of preachers were going out there who didn't have any kind of firm connection to Luther and his doctrines and what he was actually saying. And so they essentially began class warfare out in the countryside. And this has been talked up a lot by Marxist historians, which isn't necessarily totally true the way they say it, but essentially it wasn't just, we don't need the church anymore. They started saying, well, why do we need aristocrats anymore? Why is, Jesus doesn't seem to think all that much of personal property. Why are we having private property? Why are we having all these social norms that are constraining our behavior? And so some really crazy things happened, shortening this a lot. But this was sort of the birth of the Anabaptist movement. And there were massive uprisings across Germany. And when Luther figured out what was going on, he was completely appalled. There's a lot of debate about why. Certainly he didn't agree with the theological positions that they were taking or many of their actions. But it should also be said that the actions of the peasants really threatened the interests of the princes who were keeping him safe from the Catholic Church. So eventually Luther came down firmly on the side of the powers that be. There was actually a truce between the Catholics and the Protestants, and they allied together to put down the peasants' revolt. This was one of the internal conflicts that Charles V had to deal with, by the way. And the peasants ended up getting horribly slaughtered because, the peasants versus professional militaries composed of mercenaries. There was very little mercy shown, and Luther encouraged that. Marxist historians like to look back on this and say that this was evidence that Luther was a bourgeois revolutionary, and that when the proletariat got out of hand, that he ended up vacating his ideals and siding with the powers that be. That's kind of an anachronistic reading. But certainly Luther ended up siding with the powers that be, the people who protected him. It's not totally clear whether he did that for selfish reasons or ideological reasons. There's certainly plenty of evidence for both. In the 2003 movie, there's a lot more of an indication that this decision haunted him. I don't know that that's really got a lot of evidence in the documentary record. But it's certainly a stain on his historical reputation that he backed the slaughter of thousands and thousands of barely armed peasants. But it's not like they were saints to begin with.
Was this the Munster Rebellion?
That was part of it, yes. Yeah.
And that was led by a further reforming group, the Radical Reformists. So really within Luther's life, Zwingli and Calvinism got started, the Radical Reformation. It's kind of hard to get in your mind that all of these things happened within maybe a few decades.
Well, anytime you break established order, there's going to be, groups upon groups upon groups who are, we can't assume anything. So now we're going to try and grasp onto whatever we can grasp onto to build something new. And then massive disorder follows. Certainly we saw that in the Protestant Reformation. The various groups behind the peasant uprising, including the radical reformers, eventually coalesced into the Anabaptists, who were very heavily persecuted in the Holy Roman Empire, and eventually most of them migrated to Pennsylvania in the United States, where they became the Amish or the Mennonites, however you want to phrase it. That's the ultimate origin of them. Some of their ideas ended up in England, where they did help create the Baptist movement, but slightly went through a few more theological permutations before it came to the United States and became the Baptists.
The movies pretty much end the story in around the middle of the 16th century. What's the aftermath of Luther's Reformation?
So the military and political aftermath I've touched on a bit. After Luther died, there was the War of the Schmalkaldic League, which led to the Peace of Augsburg, which held for a few decades, but eventually broke down, resulting in the 30 Years' War, which killed somewhere between a quarter and a half of the population of Germany, depending on where you were, and ruined the territory economically for years to come. And then that fed on into the... after that, religious wars like that were much, much harder to persecute. States got a better handle on centralizing control over the mercenaries, and things gradually calmed down. Not that wars stopped, but they changed. There was never anything like the 30 Years' War again. In terms of religious conflict in Europe, there were small tiffs, small outbreaks of violence. The biggest one is probably the English Civil War between a more conservative Protestant King Charles and the rather more radically Protestant rest of the country, which ultimately ended up in him being beheaded and Oliver Cromwell ruling. But other than that, there weren't any really serious major conflicts about religion after the end of the 30 Years' War, at least not on that scale. From a intellectual and religious standpoint, I've talked a bit about how Calvinism spread and really became the main birthstone of most of the Protestant sects that we know about. What I haven't talked about is how Lutheranism spread around, because most of the Lutherans today are actually Scandinavian. Lutheranism is still very much alive and well in Germany, but as a result of the fighting in the 30 Years' War and everything along those lines, Germany is fairly split geographically between a more Lutheran north and a more Catholic south. But the supply lines, the trade routes that went north, that went to the Baltic and went to the Scandinavian countries, went through these Lutheran territories, and these Lutheran territories were very commercially important. They had a lot of printing presses, and the educational reforms of Melanchthon had a lot to do with this, that Protestant preachers pushed out and out and out. A lot of them ended up going into Poland and into Hungary. Those branches of Lutheranism, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, I guess, were eventually repressed. I guess unfortunately in the sense that there was a fairly large body count involved. In Hungary, they held on a while longer, but ultimately Hungary is mostly Catholic at this point. The Lutherans ended up merging with the Hussite Church in the Czech Republic, now Czechoslovakia, the Kingdom of Bohemia would be more accurate at the time. And they were all very, very brutally repressed during the 30 Years' War, and shortly thereafter, which led to, even though that area is all very Catholic at this point, they always resented the Germans after that. But, of course, the most successful place that these traveling preachers went was north, up along the trade routes into the Baltic. And they had a lot of success in converting the Danes, the Swedes, the Norwegians, the Icelanders. They moved along the whole coast of the Baltic. I believe the Finns are largely Lutheran. Many of the small Baltic republics are largely Lutheran. The one place they didn't really have any impact up north is in England, and that's probably because it was a little bit easier to get to England from the Low Countries that had a lot more influence from John Calvin, whereas the Lutherans moved up directly into Denmark from Schleswig-Holstein, and the I should say the Hanse cities, primarily Lubeck, were very Lutheran. And so the Hanse cities had a large trade network in the Baltic. So that's really... And that brings us up to, once conflicts over religion kind of calmed down, that's sort of the boundaries we have now. Lutheranism is going strong in northern Germany and the Scandinavian and Baltic areas. The Calvinists were very strong in France, the Low Countries, and in England, although there were a lot of different sects in England as a result of the English Civil War. And so a lot of the modern Protestant sects that are Calvin in origin originated in England during that whole conflict, and then came to the United States during the colonial period, where they found very fertile ground and very little central control. And then, of course, the Calvinists in France were eventually driven out by the religious persecutions of the Wars of Religion there, and ended up in the Low Countries, in Germany, and in England. And then, of course, there's the Catholic Counter-Reformation, which is its whole own thing, but the Catholics really got their act together in terms of getting rid of people like the guy who was selling indulgences at the beginning of this conversation. And that was on the one hand, and then doing a much better job, depending on your point of view, I suppose, of controlling the message and controlling the flow of ideas in the universities and stuff. Many people say that the Counter-Reformation did a lot to slow the economic and intellectual growth of those territories. I think that there's a lot more debate to be had about that, but that's one big idea. On the other hand, it should be said that it did allow Catholic theology to move into the modern world in a way that it could stand toe-to-toe with Protestantism on an intellectual level. So I think that's a good summary of everything that happened after the death of Luther.
Yeah, we definitely have it all covered right there. I think to leave us off today, since we were looking and we were using Luther as he was portrayed in these films, and some of it was a little lackluster, if you were to make a movie about Luther, what would you like to see more about him in a movie?
Well, there's a lot of limitation. I guess I should say that I really liked the 1953 movie. Despite some historical inaccuracies, it was a good, solid movie. It told a story. It had an arc. The acting was great. The sets were great. It was really good. The 2003 movie, I thought, did a lot more of modern filmmaking, focusing on these big emotions and stuff. And it ended up, it took a lot of time to try and tell the story of Luther's early life and his big come to Jesus moments. But based on really scanty evidence, and then the second half of the movie where there's a lot more that we actually know that happened just kind of fell apart. So, if I were making this movie, you're faced with this question of, do you try and make something out of very little evidence? Do you just completely abandon the evidence and make stuff up, which is certainly a plausible thing to do? No rule against that in Hollywood. Or do you stick to what we know, which is more what the 1953 movie did. I sort of think that if I were making a movie about Luther, I'd not talk about Luther so much. That story's been told. The 1953 movie exists. People like it. The popular culture tone. And I don't know that there's much more to say from the point of view of Luther. It might be interesting. I have one book that's one of my big sources on this period that I really like, which is Stephen Osmit's The Serpent and the Lamb, and it focuses on the relationship between Luther and Cranach. That's really interesting. Another thing that might be done is focusing on a Catholic during this period and make a Catholic sort of the hero of the movie, something to take another side. Not so much focus on Luther the hero, Luther the saint of the Reformation, or whatever, and focus more on, some of the wider context and some of the more interesting things that were going on at that time, and portray things a little bit more gray, because, the Catholics weren't bad guys necessarily. Yeah. They had a point. And a lot of the art that we love from this period came from the Catholic world, the Italian Reformation and everything that was going on there. Something along those lines, I guess, is what I would do.
The 1953 movie's widely available on YouTube. I thought that was a better movie. I thought the 2003 movie was close to being good. Like, there was a couple of things that they did in there, and I was like, I felt like they were getting close to, like, getting a more personal knowledge of who Luther was as, like, a real human character, but then they just always seemed to fall short of that.
Yeah, definitely. I think it might have... They may have run into time restraints or budgetary constraints. Like I said, the second half or the second third of the last third of the movie, something like that, just kind of fell apart. I've seen this a lot in modern Hollywood movies where they get to a certain point and then it's like, instead of dwelling on the personal relationships and everything that's going on, they just start going, and then this happened, and then this happened, and this happened, and then that's the end. Bye. I think maybe another hour of story to dwell a little bit more on some of the personal relationships. Like they did make the effort to jam a bit more about Catherine von Bora in there, but they could have done a lot more. She was a very interesting character, and she's really well documented. And the relationship with the head of his order, they spent time on it, but then it just kind of went away. The relationship with his his crew, with Melanchthon and Spalatin and Karlstad, that was done much better in the 1953 movie. They're like barely present in the 2003 movie, and Melanchthon in particular just kind of shows up at some point, and then he's in one other scene, which is the end with him writing to Luther and saying, "Yay, we did it! We got the confession." And that's it. You have no idea who he is or why you should care. So they could have expanded a lot more. But I agree, like, the first half of the movie was, they did a lot more to delve into his family relationships with his parents and stuff like that. They did more with his joining the church than just have him say, I don't like being a lawyer. So I appreciated that. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a huge thanks goes out to Ben Jacobs of the Wittenberg to Westphalia Wars of the Reformation podcast today as well. Links to learn more about Ben can be found at Wittenberg to Westphalia podcast.weebly.com or in the show notes. If you'd like to learn more about the Beyond the Big Screen podcast, see show notes, and connect to social media, go over to a2zhistorypage.com. On Facebook, you can find us at Beyond the Big Screen and on Twitter at Big Screen Beyond. I'd love to hear your questions, comments, and feedback. We can talk movies, and I would definitely like to hear your ideas for future episode topics or interesting guests. The email is steve@a2zhistorypage.com. And if you like what you hear, I highly recommend you sending us an iTunes or Apple Podcasts rating and reviews. These really help us and help me to learn more on how to make the show better. And I just really appreciate your comments and feedback. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time beyond the big screen.